Itinerant Imaginaries has been made possible via a bursary award from the British Art Network, BAN. And BAN is a subject specialist network supported by Tate and the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, with additional public funding provided by the National Lottery through Arts Council England. The network promotes curatorial research, practice and theory in the field of British arts. Its members include curators, academics, artists, researchers, conservators, producers and programmers at all stages of their professional careers. The order of this evening will be that each of our speakers in the order of the programme will present for about 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll move from one to the other, and then we'll start a conversation with the panel first off and then open it up for taking questions, as I mentioned before. So that's just to kind of set the scene and to tell you about the pragmatics that we need to do in terms of being online here, which is in some ways so frustrating of not seeing people in the flesh and being more informal about everything. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the project as well, and to introduce this. This is actually an online sessions. We've been developing them from the Creating Interference core group members, and particularly conceived by myself and Lola Olufemi, who's also with us here, based, as I mentioned, at the University of Westminster, London, and CREAM, a centre that is concerned with leading on practice-based and theoretical-based research in arts and culture. And we additionally are also associated with the Stuart Hall Foundation. So as the title suggests, and some of you may have heard a little bit of this, but I just wanted to reiterate that Itinerant Imaginaries, we have an expressed interest in drawing on our thinkers, critics and makers as ways to bring into question the practice associated with cultural art objects, their function, societal role, permanence, collection, and the institutional structures that support them. Itinerant Imaginaries, then, asks more questions around the place and permanence of art objects as they are produced and circulated. Questions being asked are, how might we continue to contribute to critiquing the arts ecosystem, not only through creating work itself and analysing and gaining knowledge from it, but how do we develop an alternative and more radical critique and discourse about the wider arts ecosystem and its infrastructure? How might we bring our imaginative space and imagination to thinking about futurity, to the art system, infrastructure itself, as well as obviously in the art making and the practice? Who is already doing this, and how might we look for alternatives to a system that's already been skewed? Itinerant Imaginaries is interested in listening to ways scholars, artists, activists are increasingly contributing different ways of doing, making, and thinking. We're interested in understanding more radical action that rethinks and imagines differently configured systems. And this is especially, I mean, I reiterated this in my earlier contribution yesterday, that this is especially urgent now. And I think Sapake definitely reinforced that kind of idea of urgency, which I think we all are very aware of. We want to have a discussion of what it means to change the process and practices themselves, which requires thinking, acting, making, and in particular from what we imagine to be from the ground up. This is in my view, the only way this can happen. And this is significant in response to the policy moves that I think I've mentioned that many of our institutions are making at this point in time, under the banners of inclusivity, equality, etc. We all are very familiar with these statements that are coming out for very particular reasons, and quite right too, and it's having an impact. This panel, it's having an impact, and we can talk a little bit about that. This panel is an opportunity to hear from persons as current and future activists, curators, critics, artists, who have been working and researching from different global locations beyond the UK. And this is really quite important for us to be able to think this through. Really important to us thinking about the spaces of transmission. In other words, exchanging knowledge and connecting from one generation to another. So there's no pressure on our speakers here then, but it is, we're just trying to put a spotlight in particular about people who are already doing this kind of work. And so in this sense, we've got wonderful contributions and to understand what Françoise Vergès talked about, of us working with the notion of entangled temporalities. And I really thought that was quite an important way in which we might think about this. In other words, differentiated conditions of temporal zones of life experience in different locations, and they're triggered through in different locations. And how to learn from them, as we did early in the afternoon with Sapaki Angiama, Lauren Craig and Rose Nordin, of ways in which they have developed decolonial feminist art practices in their locations, in dialogue with the UK and in response to imperial or colonial histories. We are exploring what we might now call the pastness as a field of practice and its relationship to art making and meaning. So without further delay, our first presenter is to introduce Annie Jael Kwan. Annie Jael Kwan is an independent curator and researcher whose exhibition making, programming, publication, and teaching practice intersects with contemporary art, art history, and cultural activism. As co-director of Something Human, a curatorial initiative, she has presented live art projects across the UK and Europe and launched the Southeast Asia Performance Collection in 2017 that represents 50 artists from the region. Annie leads Asia Art Activism, AAA, a research network that launched Till We Meet Again, IRL, an expansive digital arts program in 2020 with 6 other UK, EU grassroots partners. And she's launched the Tools to Transform, which was co-initiated with June Lin Go, a resource for Asian diaspora organizing in 2021, which has received the European Cultural Foundation's Culture of Solidarity grant. And congratulations to Annie for that. So Annie, I'll just hand over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Roshini. So firstly, thank you so much for this very kind invitation, Roshini, and the Creating Interference team. Before I begin, because much of what I will discuss today is based on a collective approach, I'd like to give my migrants' version of acknowledgements to the collective and collecting practices that have been cultural predecessors, such as Green Papaya in Manila, Independent Archive in Singapore, Rumah Ayapanas in Kuala Lumpur, Nyasang Collective in Hanoi, Sasa Art Projects in Phnom Penh, and Orang Rupa in Jakarta. I would also like to stand in solidarity with our post-colonial colleagues in Myanmar as they rally alongside fellow citizens today on June 8th against a military coup, which has seen 911 civilians of casualties and 4,704 false arrests committed since 1st February by the military junta. In thinking about the provocation set for today's session in relation to what I'm going to discuss, I have a bit of a preamble where I wish to sort of trouble several keywords, or how several keywords trouble me. And also in that sense, maybe kind of establish my own kind of approach and positionality in this. So just a few points about what is a nation and thus what is a national collection or archive. The notion of the nation is itself a fairly young concept, with the oldest sovereign state being just over 200 years old. And in the region of Southeast Asia, it is even younger, with the emergence of independent nation states following the wake of World War II and the Cold War. I raise this to ask if firstly, we might be too mesmerized by this gloss of the national, as if it somehow represents the highest and most unshakable standard of value. Secondly, it follows then to question what then is a national collection or archive that is supposedly representative of, or does the work of bolstering the conception of validation of such so-called nation. If at this juncture, you might start to wonder why I've led with introducing a notion of Southeast Asia and what has that got to do with Britain, then perhaps the 2016 Tate Britain Artists and Empire exhibition would be in agreement, since works and artists from Southeast Asian states, including British Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Borneo, Hong Kong, were entirely elided due to their not being present in the British collections from which the Tate curators made selections for the exhibition, though they were pleased to repeat several times during the exhibition symposium that the project would tour as a second iteration in co-production with the National Gallery Singapore. What then is a national collection if it excludes materials from the full historical reach of empire? And why is it that the understanding of Britain is told in one way in the UK and another outside of it? Also then, what might be the difference, should we think, between using the word archive and the word collection? Does the former imply a more calcified stronghold of authoritative knowledge, excuse me, such that the contemporary archives veer towards the use of the term collection instead? However, has collection also come to imply a sense of ownership or a kind of value based on the accumulation of cultural capital that itself reflects problematic power relations in institutions, art networks, and markets? And lastly, also, while thinking about these broader and very important issues of history, memory, forgetting, as an independent practitioner, I also have to weigh up very pragmatic concerns of visibility, validation, because that's a way of getting paid and making a living, without taking anything away from the historical examples and theoretical strategies of fugitivity or marronage, as brilliantly discussed yesterday. As someone who has to think about rent in London, there is something that seems romanticized in being itinerant, perhaps imbued by the sense of mobility, the inference of escape, or the slipperiness in which we are resistant towards being appropriated, owned, instrumentalized, contained, and thus relegated back to the back drawer. But perhaps there's another kind of radicality which I would venture in relation to practice, that there isn't just an inside and outside, but there are multiple layers and circles of insideness and outsideness, and one has to be a double or even triple agent. And you take the money, but you can't really run, but you try to do something else, and you try to do it ethically and with care, and then turn around and explain why this was the best way forward, in a way to try and upmanage or imbricate the giver in the giving, and thus change through praxis the conditions and possibilities of resourcing. It's a constant juggle and interplay between insiderness and outsiderness, performing insiderness and radicality to differing levels of success across cultural translation. And if stories are what gives meaning and energy to process, then it's telling stories one way or another way is a way to future new practices, such that the story may change with regards to what is seen, talked about, and who gets paid. So after this preamble, I wish to discuss very briefly two projects, the Southeast Asia Performance Collection and the Asia Art Activism's 2019 program being present. The Southeast Asia Performance Collection, SAPC, was initiated by Something Human, then co-directed by Alessandra Cinetti and myself, in collaboration with Batu Balani, whom we commissioned, and Java Arts in Cambodia, Independent Archive in Singapore, the art projects in Saigon, New Space Arts Foundation in Hue, Nyasan Collective in Hanoi, Fa Selpat Ponlu in Battambang, Salsa Art Projects in Phnom Penh, Sanke also in Battambang, Six Space in Hanoi, and Studio Revolt between Phnom Penh and the USA. And this was funded with the support of the Arts Council England, the Artists International Development Fund, and the National Arts Council of Singapore. Launched in 2017, the archive or collection consists of a digital archive with some hard copy materials consisting of artworks, photographic and video documentation, research and other practice-related records related to live art from and in relation to Southeast Asia. It currently resides in the study room of the Live Art Development Agency, the UK's main agency for the development of live art, its practitioners and discourse. It is offered as an open access resource to scholars, curators, and artists. Why did we want to build such an archive? We can draw upon some thoughts offered from Ariella Azule. Archive documents are not items of a completed past, but rather active elements in the present. Their interest in archives is not in the past as something over and done, but rather to the ways of intervention in it, its transmission, the picture it gives about the being together in the world. Their interest in the archive expresses curiosity, but also dissatisfaction, doubt, and suspicion, arousing their interest in the structure of the archive, the forms of control it produces, or the possibilities of unraveling and recomposing it, no less than in that which is stored inside, as if it were there on its own. It is about the basic right to share the archive, a right embodied in the archive as such by the mere fact that the documents it holds regard those who wish to actualize this right. And we wanted to see this archive as a shared place, to define it as a shared place that enables one to maintain the past incomplete, or to preserve what Walter Benjamin refers to as the incompleteness of the past. So the SAPC was developed through this increasing awareness of the rich and interesting live art work that was happening in Southeast Asia, and the corresponding lack of materials for research within the study room, which at that time held over 5,000 items related to live art, and was also seen as the largest collection of live art materials in Europe. So via various self-initiated research residencies and trips to Vietnam and Cambodia, and also commissioned to Batu Pelani to collect materials from the Philippines, and also gathering from Something Human's own archive contributed from its Southeast Asian and diaspora practitioners. The archive was composited also then with the donation from Singaporean pioneer performance artist Lee Wen, who donated his entire digital archive. And the SAPC was launched at that time with about 27,000 digital items, representing the 50 artists from the region. So the aim of the archive was to try to open up dialogue around Southeast Asian diaspora in the UK and Europe, and to disrupt a UK-British Eurocentric art historical focus, and to encourage younger researchers and practitioners to utilize the archive to broaden scholarship at tertiary and independent levels, and encourage artists to respond to the work in the archive, to future an understanding of broader understanding of diasporic narratives, as well as an understanding of a wider art historical legacy. And so some few reflections in our attempt, in a way that we recognize that even trying to build an archive was problematic. First, why did we name it the collection instead of the archive? On one hand, it was in discussion with LADA, but also on the other, it was sort of an acknowledgement of the issues that had been discussed around archive and archiving in relation to the processes of gathering, sorting, indexing, access, translation, representation. And at the same time that we launched the archive, we had a symposium, which you can see an image here, which the program insisted on interrogating and interrupting the collection the moment it was formed. The aim of the collection was to keep it live. During the symposium, there were commissions to artists to create new work, perform reenactment and reinscription of work that would be further included in the archive. And that way we hope to encourage people to see it as an open repository with continued research in the region and an invitation to other artists, researchers, and scholars to contribute freely. We also spent quite a lot of time thinking about the ethics of the archive in terms of its permissions, copyright, and credits. And however, even with that, there were many, perhaps we call it dangers or possible failures. For example, I think one issue that does come up is the notion of fees. In one instance, it was put to me by a mainstream institution that if they wanted to do an exhibition of the work in the archive, because the work was not necessarily artwork, but was seen as documentation, therefore institutions could not allocate budget to pay any artists. And that was something that we really had to fight against. And also, since its launch in 2017, little had been done since on the part of LADA to instigate further use or development of the collection. So, for example, it still remains not accessible online, even though there's been discussion, there were discussions of putting it online, and perhaps that was due to restrictions of budget. And I know that there is not also any tracking about who's using it. And I do know people are using it because my students from Central St. Martin's have been writing essays referencing it. So perhaps in this instance, the SAPC was trying to take up and make space in the study room, to make camp within this institutional space. But, only in a way its diaspora practitioners are responding to it and not the actual institution. So this leads me to to talk about how an example of a diaspora artist who did respond to it, and that was as part of AAA's 2019 Being Present program, the Manchester Art Gallery. Okay, so just to set a context, Asia Art Activism, or AAA, It's a grassroots, intergenerational, interdisciplinary research network that explores the contested paradigm of Asia in the UK and the proximities of art and activist practice. Members and participants are local and international artists, curators, and researchers interested in complicating the definitions of Asia and raising visibility of alternative, lesser-known diaspora artists and narratives in relation to Southeast, Southeast, and West Asia. As members of lesser visible and lesser represented communities, there was a concern revolving space and occupying space. On the one hand, with the boon of free studio and event space at Raven Row, where we were in residency from 2018 to 2021, we had the opportunity to experiment with many different formats of activities, ways of being together and working together that meant moving away from conventional hierarchies and unlearning certain modes of working in the art world to center instead care, both promiscuous and private types of care, and ethics-based practices and communal relations, and questioning and nurturing what is the process of collectivizing within the context of the UK. So this would manifest in a series of public programming, food-centered events, mini residencies, and workshops. And here's one where we're trying to make a timeline to try to mark Asian and diaspora art and activism. We also had a series of experimental radio and sound programs. And as part of this process, we were also discovering what it meant to work together in an intersectional, non-competitive model, finding strength in numbers and shared resources, and developing an approach to our presentation of work to create presence and visibility in the public space, a kind of performative solidarity, to paraphrase Judith Butler, that may transform the space it occupies. So one example from this was that in the 2019 Being Present program, which was a live-up program curated as a response to the exhibition Speech Acts, Reflection, Imagination, Repetition at the Manchester Art Gallery, curated by Hamad Nasser with Kate Jessen. The Speech Acts project was itself based on the research led by Black Artists in Modernism, BAM, a 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council as a collaboration between the University of the Arts, London, and Middlesex University. The project sought to redress an art historical amnesia to draw attention to work by Black and migrant artists. For instance, BAM had done research that demonstrated that such works might have been collected into various regional collections, but were mostly forgotten about as they had not been shown, and hence neither preserved nor programmed around. Speech Acts as an exhibition project thus focused on showing these lesser known works by Black and diaspora artists in an entanglement of art historical narratives, with well-known works by British establishment artists. This included bringing to the fore works by artists such as Kim Lim, Rashid Arain, Anwar Jalal Shemza, and Lee Yuan Chia. For the live-up program, I invited 3 younger generation diaspora and migrant artists, Bettina Fung, Ada Howe, and Nicholas T. from AAA, to create new performances to respond to the themes of the exhibition. And I'll just focus here on one of the performances. Nicholas T. is a Singaporean-born artist whose practice is based on live performance. As a postgraduate student, he responded to the materials on the future of imagination festivals in Southeast Asia, made accessible by the SAPC, to create a mini map that showed the rich circulation of live art practices beyond the UK. For the Being Present program, he also researched the work of pioneering performance artist Lee Wen, whose documentation was also in the SAPC. He would base his performance, titled Yellow Peril, on Lee's iconic performance series, Journey of a Yellow Man, 1992 to 2012, which was itself instigated by Lee's experience of racism against his Chinese ethnicity while he was a student in the UK. For his adaptation, T sat behind a large magnifying Fresnel screen and he coated his face with yellow paint and applied on top gold sheets of gold leaf as a gesture to the changing forms of racism against the Chinese associated with the influx of Chinese students into the UK university sectors and the fear of the Chinese economy. On his body, he hung 4 retro cassette recorders that played Missing You, reinscribed from Lee Wen's 2010 Anyhow Blues revival project that was itself originally intended as a critique of Singapore's first de facto ban of performance art in 1994. T connected with Lee's ethical critical ethos emerging from the outside in a Singaporean context, with the negotiations that speech acts brokered with institutionalized hierarchies of power in the case of the Manchester Art Gallery, which tried to ban the rest of T's performance. Although transgressive acts by artists have been canonized as part of live art history, T's proposal for cutting into his body the words "bloody foreigner" had been censored, as the gallery feared appearing to condone self-harm in youth in the city of Manchester. So outside of a proof process, T would perform this part of the performance, kneeling outside the front portico of the gallery with its neoclassical pillars. And then unexpectedly, he would get up and then stormed into the exhibition gallery, surprising even I, the curator, and he pressed his bloody torso onto the title wall of the exhibition. Speaking sharply, perhaps, to the pains the migrant has to undertake to leave a mark in an institutional space, as well as being prescient to the sharp spike of anti-Asian racism in the UK and internationally that unfolded rapidly in the following year. Following this program, we were invited to adapt this project as a cover collaboration with the Paul Mellon Centre's British Art Studies, where the performances were adapted as digital performances. So just a couple of thoughts here that remain unresolved for me that I'll just conclude with. Incidentally, Lee Wen himself criticized the national accolade after he received Singapore's Cultural Medallion in 2005, which led him to explore ideas of death of the singular national celebrated artist through his later performance works and the resurrection of a more collective approach to practice. There's some food for reflection here as both home and migrant practitioners. What does it mean to be enunciated international narratives? Is the notion of the individual singular artist so aligned with the white male cishet artist that only the collective of Black and brown, gendered, trans, queer artists may replace them? Another thought is I also recall some feedback back in 2017 with regards to a proposal for researching Lee Wen with a mainstream institution in the UK, was that since he was not already in the collection, it wouldn't be relevant to research him to put him in the collection. So there's a kind of circular logic of funding and presence and visibility that is very real. And also I think lastly, I think it's just to reflect a little bit as an Asian diaspora and migrant practitioner, that I often feel like, the in-between space is a very problematic space as well, and can be a space of frustration as well as a space of opportunity. For example, although my work portfolio record has shown a practice that works intersectionally across into communities, both white and diaspora, because I have undertaken to address Asia as a conceptual mode, I've also had instances where I've been ghettoized in this critical description that I don't work enough with other communities. But simultaneously, I've also been at University of the Arts staff meetings to address specifically BAME academic issues, to be asked my aims and strategies for permanent long-term change as an hourly paid academic. So that's also how it's linked to being an independent practitioner, not with a permanent contract with any institution, that you are at the same time too radical or too outlier, but also too institutional and always kind of in a precarious state of migrant in-betweenness. So I'll just conclude that here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was fantastic. I hear what you say about the economics of how we might think through surviving, which I think has really been raised already as well, about this pragmatic view that we also need to think about. And I really enjoyed the way in which you thought about this idea of a more collective space of learning to be collective, right? And learning to care for yourself and learning different modes of being and working with each other, which I think is invaluable to take from this. So I'll just now go on to introducing Bisan, who's our second speaker, Bisan Abu Eisheh, who's an artist, researcher, and doctoral candidate with us at Westminster. And he uses art as a tool to investigate history, society, and politics. He works across media, creating installations and interventions with a practice situated both within the gallery space and the public sphere, and currently investigating the post-Oslo Agreement 1993 reality in juxtaposition with visual Palestinian art practices. Bisan exhibits widely in major institutions and events, including OMI International Residency Program in Ghent, USA in 2018, the Palestinian Museum in 2017, Moscow Museum of Modern Art in 2016, and the Istanbul Biennale. He has also curated a number of international events and programs, including Once Upon a City intervention in collaboration with Al-Hawash in Jerusalem in 2018, and has undertaken residencies, as I mentioned, the OMI. So just a hand to Bisan, and thank you again for coming along and contributing.
Thank you so much, Roshini, and thank you for inviting me together with the Creating Interference team. I feel like humbled to be among this amazing lineup. So the title of my presentation is Breathing Archives, and rather than treating it as an artist talk, I'm going to speak about the process of shifting from working with archives as an artist towards towards the title of this event, Itinerant Imaginaries. So how this breathing archive became my itinerant imaginary, basically, about Palestine and the Palestinian arts. Breathing Archive is not only the title of my presentation. It's basically a stage that encapsulates a long process of negotiating the meaning of archive in the Palestinian context. I won't pretend that I was always aware how this process has been evolving at every stage in my art research practice, in my art practice and research practice, because I have been drawn to archives since the very beginning of my experience with art in 2008, and from that moment I had gone through different stages of dealing with archives, especially in a place like Palestine where there are no institutional archives, or there are barely institutional archives. But thanks to my PhD experience, that I became able to reflect on my practice in more mature ways and in juxtaposition with many elements that plays a major role in shaping the environments I live in. The idea behind my project was conceived, as far as I understand, at an international event or at an international art exhibition in Jerusalem. Basically, I was invited to exhibit in Jerusalem, which is the city of my birth, and it's the city where I grew up most of my life. And in that event, we had to, in the evening of the opening, we had to walk from one venue to another inside the old city in order to look at the arts. And that while that was happening, I encountered a number of people that I'm familiar with because I am from that place, and automatically I could see in their eyes, and even in some of them didn't feel ashamed to verbalize it, that I somehow became alienated from the moment that I, was joining this group. They even were wondering, is it a group of tourists? What's going on? And that really made me, that incident made me question the importance of being an artist if my own people cannot relate to it, if the people I live within cannot understand that there is an art exhibition, there is a biennial, there is a grand event happening around them. And also, I'm aware that this was not a coincidence. It was a culmination of few years of discomfort toward the dynamics of arts in Palestine. So since I started my career as an artist, I was comfortable with the political nature of my artworks because I was aware of their source of inspiration, the way they came into being, particularly when I was living in Palestine, living and working in Palestine. It was loaded with political experience I was witnessing or experiencing on the way. Only a few years after that, I became aware of how my practice has branded me as a politicized artist in the mainstream fields of art. And that I'm taking part of. The issue with realizing this label, that in some cases, it made me feel passive, especially when realizing that what I do, as well as myself, are rendered into becoming products subject to supply and demand. It was even more uncomfortable when that was happening in Palestine, within the occupation, within the cycle of colonization and occupation. My discomfort grew because when that was my discomfort grew because I was aware that I chose to work in the arts in order to have a voice, considering my oppressed Palestinian background. Instead, stumbling on those realities of the art field that I work within had brought me to the feeling of passivity again. Nevertheless, pointing out discomfort and passivity in the arts does not necessarily mean undermining the importance of an existing mainstreams or the existing mainstream fields of art. What concerns me in this research is the possibles I have like the possibles or the options that I have to pursue my activity as an agent in the art field beyond the restrictions of a normalized mainstream art field or also the normalized politics of Palestine. So I just explained how how the whole research basically kick-started. In order to question that status quo, I had chosen the Oslo Agreement as a main event to test how life changed around it, or around the Oslo Agreement in my society. Above all, that it remains colonized even after the peace agreement. First, I wanted to understand how things shifted politically and socially. Then I was hoping that this would help me to understand what has changed artistically. The Oslo Agreement basically is the declaration of principles on interim self-government arrangements signed between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which also called PLO as an abbreviation, on September 13, 1993, where the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in peace, accepted UN Security Council resolutions 2.242 and 338. These are resolutions concerned the return of refugees expelled both from Palestine in 1940 and 67, and rejected the violence and terrorism. In response, Israel officially recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the representative of the Palestinian people only. The reason behind choosing that moment is due to the fact that it was the moment when the Palestinian context has shifted from revolution into institution. But also in relation to the arts, it was also because I was drawing comparisons between the dynamics and strategies that me and my generation as an artist were using in Palestine, and the dynamics that I remember from observing my father as a theater artist back in the early 90s, where I used to, I remember some of his peers would come to one room of our house, close the door and do some rehearsals for the theater, or even when I would go to the theater, I would find half of the decoration of the house making the decoration of the play, and the other half comes from other members. So there was, and comparing that to the moment of individuality and in like a moment of individualism and pursuing opportunities and also submitting to the art market, has made me feel that, there is a big difference between what I saw my father doing and what we are doing nowadays. The process towards analyzing the things that influences the creation, production, and reception of my artwork, and figuring out a way to negotiate those towards other possibilities, has unfolded in two parallel stages. And these two parallel stages, of course, they are not it's not a coincidence that I chose to do a practice-based PhD, because this is what I realized that I have been doing since many years, that I always engage in a research process, and then this research unfolds towards or like the outcome of the research, or in the middle of the process of the research, some artworks happen. I start producing video art, performances, installations connected with what I am extracting from my research. So the first, I'm going to speak about like the theoretical the theoretical direction and the parallel direction. So it's about how the research was influencing the practice, but also how the practice changed my ideas about archive and about Palestine within the process. I began to unpack the Palestinian historical timeline from the moment of Nakba, which is a term refers to the colonization of Palestinian land and the expulsion of 2/3 of its people in 1948. Of course, until nowadays, until this moment, or what I like to refer to it as the post-Oslo moment. So, and I did that in two different in two different stages. The first stage, so in the two stages, I went through reviewing the Palestinian history, like from the moment of 1948 until nowadays, but rather to avoid being didactic and repeating history in a chronological way, which what you find basically in history books nowadays. I wanted to kind of like push this further. I wanted a new knowledge. I just didn't want to state the obvious, to tell the people, that Palestine was occupied in 48 and 67 and etc., 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 etc. So in those two stages, I chose to trace archives in relation to this history. So I was tracing the Palestinian history and explaining what was happening in every moment in 1948, which areas were occupied, and what do we have in that moment, or what was going on in that moment in relation to what we know about Palestine, the knowledge about Palestine, the text, and how the Israelis started looting all written objects and materials and shipped them to Israeli archives, shipped them to institutions which later formed the Israeli archives post 1948. And in the second stage, I did the same. I repeated the same history, but with art. So as I was tracing like 48 and 67 and the beginning of armed resistance, and then the signing of the Oslo Agreement in relation to what existed as Palestinian art. So in 1948, when Palestine fell under direct occupation, what Palestinian artists were making, and in 67, what they were making, and when the armed resistance started, what Palestinians were making, and both processes were necessary for me to understand where do I come from, and how I want to, and how somehow transcribe or translate to myself why I'm doing what I'm doing, like in relation to that history. Especially that we have no institutions that has the capacity to tell the young generations in Palestine to explain to us who we are as a people, and how did we reach that moment of time. So at the end of these two, this theoretical direction, I was able to form a number of new realizations which were not there at the beginning of the research. Like, for example, I realized that the Oslo Agreement was not, like, I was dealing with the Oslo Agreement as something fallen from the sky. I had personal reason connected with observations of my father, connected with the way I believe in politics and history. But then I realized that actually the Oslo Agreement was only the Palestinian share of what shared universally, because 1993, the time of the signing of the Oslo Agreement, or around that, was the time when was basically the time when neoliberalism has prevailed. It was the time when the USSR collapsed and the EU was established. So the fall of the anti-campaign, the anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist has weakened and has basically led. And this is not to justify the Oslo Agreement, but it's rather to be more scientific in the conclusions and the understanding that I am drawing. The second realization was that actually from the moment of Oslo, Palestine has become incomplete. Like, the knowledge about Palestine has become incomplete because the Oslo Agreement defined Palestine as the West Bank and Gaza, and that's what I mean by shifting from a context of a country under occupation into a state building project over the West Bank and Gaza. And and therefore the dynamics of knowledge production and distribution within this cycle have continued to, or have started to produce an incomplete knowledge about Palestine that defines only those in the West Bank and Gaza as Palestinians, dropping people like me from Jerusalem from this cycle of knowledge production and distribution, dropping Palestinians who didn't escape from what became Israel after 1948, dropping them down also from, and also the refugees outside, they are dropped down from the knowledge production and distribution machine. The last part is that I also realized that what I'm trying to deal with, this made me realize, so that studying art and then studying knowledge in relation to history made me realize that actually art has the same, like art is just a reflection of the same picture of politics. Art is falling or has fallen into the dynamics of the state project, and I will explain more. So this is basically to clarify the divisions that Palestinians ended up. So only the dark orange areas are defined as Palestine nowadays, while actually Palestinians, like there are over 1,300,000 Palestinians living in the light orange areas, which is so-called Israel. And there are refugees living in Lebanon, refugees living. So none of them, when we say Palestine, Palestinian art, Palestinian knowledge, Palestinian institutions, none of the entities in those institutions, or like, don't want to say none because it's not completely none, but it is like the majority of those institutions are dropped down from what defines Palestine as Palestine. And also, this is just to also, this is another diagram that explains how Israel is dividing Palestinians through different identification cards and through different, that prevent even the Palestinians themselves from understanding themselves as one people, because they are living different conditions and different circumstances. Each one of them is living their Palestinian experience in a different way. So for example, and this is something that I personally had fallen into, this article by my dear friend Yazid Anani, which was written in October 2013, if I'm not mistaken. It's called In the Shadow of Palestinian Contemporary Art. And if we take a zoom in, like, so the understanding of the title is that this article is going to take us through contemporary Palestinian art. But if we read the second paragraph of the article, Yazid says that with the death of the notion of nationalism and decay in the belief of democracy through parliamentary and political representation, and with the calls for freedom of the tainted Arab nationalist, of the tainted nationalist Arab regimes, etc., 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 Palestinians strive to build their nation state. So why? I don't know. I mean, this is not to pose an accusation towards Yazid as a writer or a scholar, but it's to point out that even myself, as a Palestinian, I had fallen into this dynamic, and this dynamic that makes basically, or these dynamics, or these problematic dynamics that this article is following, because in the title it uses Palestinians without like the Palestinian, like, so it's going to walk us through Palestinian art, but in reality, it's in the head or in the beginning of the article, it is only talking about those Palestinians who are building their national state. So it's not telling us where, and although it mentions artists who are not based in the West Bank and Gaza only, but the article talks about their participation in the scene of the West Bank and Gaza. So that made me realize that Palestine that I was writing about or the Palestinian scene that I wanted to criticize in the beginning of my research is not complete even. It is just a scene, a Palestinians. So to speak, so this is the theoretical side and the conclusions connected with the theoretical side. On the practical side, I wanted to build an archive, and initially I wanted to build an archive because I thought that instead of using my family letters as what I called spontaneous archives, or relying on institutional archives, because I moved out of Palestine and now I can go to London. I can go in London or in the UK or other countries to open archives and extract information about Palestine. But those realizations and the dynamics of the very act of collection and maintenance, which is very colonial, made me realize that I'm actually not interested in what is in those archives. I'm actually interested in what is not in those archives. And therefore, I realized that maybe I need to take control or take a direction towards documentation in relation to that. So this diagram explains how I wanted to build this archive through dialogues and participations with the artists. And in order to do that, initially, I started developing a number of mind maps, which basically was like an individual work based on researching online and contacting like, you know, personal, like contacting friends that I know, that I have like a personal relationship with them, in order to apply different category to organize them in different categories based on where they live, the generation they belong to, the mediums they produce, the visibility of those artists. Are they known locally or regionally or internationally, again based on studying their biographies, until I started to include myself in those mind maps where here I'm like, for example, I'm tracing the financial resources that involved in my creation as an artist. So in the right you see the institutions where I studied art and all the flags connected with the scholarship I got, like from Norway, EU, England, and on the other side you see the outputs, like how that I'm trying to understand how that is related where I'm seen, where I am visible. And this is, maybe I'm imagining this as a prototype to something that would grow in the future. Yeah. So I mean, just to close, I'm going to say that what happened, just to conclude. So both the theoretical process and the practical process has basically made me change my methodologies. I realized that the individual collection attempt that I had taken in order to build this archive are not sufficient when I realized that the gravity of division in Palestine. Therefore, I had changed. This had taken me into two. I mean, I'm just going to speak about what happened. I'm going to skip speaking about this artwork because I don't have time. I'm so sorry. But I'm going to speak about the dynamic, basically what happened to the archive and what I call my itinerant imaginary, basically. So the division had taken me to Haifa, where I decided to basically, rather than doing the archive and the mind maps on my own, I wanted to do it on the ground. So I chose Haifa because Haifa is not recognized as Palestine. It's recognized as an Israeli city. It contains, or it has 20% Arab minority. And through living there, through renting a flat there and conducting individual and collective meetings with those artists, I started to use their art practices as a point of departure to map how they are living and how they make those artworks in this environment, which is not labeled as Palestine. So by doing this practice, I'm trying to break from the map that is imposed on the Palestinian people towards a map that we form with our bodies wherever we live, because we live our experience as Palestinians, because all these conditions that we have nowadays are rooted in the moment of colonization of our land and the new colonial or the colonial situation, the sub-colonial situation that we have. And of course, if you are following what has been going on recently in Palestine, it's easy to understand that the colonial situation is not about clashes between Hamas and Israel. And so I'm just going to end it here. And in the questions, I might be able to elaborate a little bit about just how that helped me to basically manage my position as an artist.
Thank you, Bisan. Thank you so much. I think, that for me, there's lots of questions around this idea of the breathing archive, which I think is really a great title, and how you might unpack that. But there's also something quite interesting about this absolute collapse that you're working from in relation to the dynamics of the state project and the archive, and how this gets disentangled through the notion of practice, which is a fantastic way of approaching it, seems to me, and we would love to know more about it. So lastly, I just want to introduce Chandra Frank, who is a feminist researcher, and thank you so much for joining us, Chandra, and curator who works with the intersections of archives, waterways, gender, sexuality, and race. Her curatorial practice explores the politics of care, experimental forms of narration, and the colonial grammar embedded within display and exhibition arrangements. She has published in peer-reviewed journals and exhibition catalogues, including Feminist Review, the Small Axe Flosser catalogue, The Places Here publication and the collection Tongues. And she recently co-edited a special issue on archives for the Feminist Review. Her dissertation and her current book project looks at the everyday experiences of the transnational feminist and queer Black migrant and refugee movement in the Netherlands. Chandra is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Charles Phelps Taft Research Center at the University of Cincinnati, USA. And thanks so much, Chandra, for joining us and contributing.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. And to my fellow co-presenters, it's just already been very insightful so far. So what I wanted to do today is use my time to talk a little bit about the Black migrant and refugee feminist movement that I researched at the Atria Archives, which is located in the city center of Amsterdam. And as a brown queer feminist who grew up in Amsterdam, I was interested in the history of queer and feminist movement work, especially movements of color, and kind of thinking about the lack of that when I was coming of age, but also just the way that the narrative around second wave white feminism was structured just gave me a lot of insight in terms of how do we deal with these feminist histories? What is the role of the archive in feminist and queer studies, and how do we kind of negotiate that? So one of the things that I did was kind of starting this project with just an inquiry into what this movement looked like, specifically in the 70s and in the 80s. And I've done archival research, I've done interviews, I have worked with different archival materials. And so part of this project, the kind of research component, if you will, of the project is more or less completed, although it's obviously I have only kind of done a snippet in terms of archival research, looking at different collectives, and there is so much more to research. But part of what I wanted to do today was reflect a little bit about that research process, as well as thinking now about how this research process kind of intersects with my curatorial process, and thinking about what it would look like to curate an exhibition, which I'm kind of thinking through the politics of curating archives always within my curatorial practice. But for this project specifically, I've been kind of trying to merge these different forms of research and engagement with the archive. So I think the first thing I wanted to note was conversations about access. So I was working with a institutional, predominantly white feminist archive. As I said, it's called Atria. You can look it up online and look at their collection. They hold one of the biggest collections on international women's movements in Europe. And part of the issue with trying to research the BMR movement, or the Black migrant and refugee movement, was that in the 80s, there were a couple very small scattered BMR archives, kind of makeshift collections. And one of those initiatives was called Flamboyant, which was actually properly funded, but a lot of those initiatives weren't funded. And so, you know, the question of access was already a feminist issue in the 80s. And what we started to see was that it was really hard to keep those makeshift grassroots archives, to keep them alive. Like, there was a lack of funding, there was a lot of voluntary work. It was just really hard to kind of sustain that. So a lot of those archives, in whatever form, didn't actually make it. And so a lot of the materials that I'm talking about, personal archives, magazines, flyers, recordings of movement work, which could have been related to different collectives, as I said, or magazines or publications, as well as different demonstrations, art and theater productions, political work, policy work. So really quite broad. And a lot of that material then kind of went back to this white feminist institutional archive. So part of my inquiry was kind of what to do with this white institutional feminist archive, right? And how to kind of navigate the limitations and possibilities of doing research in this archive, where the materials of the BMR movement are basically kind of scattered in this broader collection. So there are questions here about genealogy and how we construct feminist histories of color, and specifically the stories of Black and brown women that were part of this history, that are not just marginalized within the wider national discourse, but then also become marginalized within this archive. And so it was important for me to kind of think about the different modalities and different uses of access. So of course, when I think about access, it wasn't just about being able to get into the archive, which I think there are important considerations there either way, in terms of physical access, but also in terms of disability, in terms of broader conversations about what it means to be physically able to access archives. But also other conversations about how do we kind of think about the racialized taxonomies of catalogs, of filing systems, and what becomes part of those filing systems and what doesn't, right? So there are conversations about access that were important to me in terms of figuring out, of course, one can never really know a collection or what is available, and what is this kind of, why is it important to get to know a collection? What are our own limitations in that process? And on the other hand, I think it's important to note that there's only one book published within the Dutch context that talks about the Black migrant and refugee feminist movement, which besides being an active Dutch movement, was also a transnational movement. So there were important links with the UK, with Germany, South Africa, with the United States. So, this is not just a history that's relevant for the Dutch context, but much broader. So there were conversations and questions around access that I am grappling with, and really kind of thinking about this notion of the collection, and that even within this white feminist archive and institution, there are clear problematics around what we are able to access and why, and on whose terms we're able to access that. So part of what I wanted to also highlight is the messiness of archives, and this is just a screenshot of the Atria website, which again you can navigate the collection online and have a look at that. So the messiness of archives, I think it was really important in terms of conceptualizing this project and thinking about, again, the complications of access, is to think about what does it mean to conceptualize and theorize and practically work with diasporic feminist and queer archives? What does it mean if we put these different words and the different genealogies of these words and these histories in conversation with each other? So part of this kind of navigating the archive was very much, what lives between the files and the boxes and the catalogs, and what doesn't become part of the official history making process. And this is also obviously to do with language. One example that I'll note that's similar to the UK, a lot of the active organizers within the BMR movement, for instance, use the concept of political Blackness, which is a problematic concept. And I think there's lots to say about that, but specifically, there is a certain nuance that gets lost in these kind of umbrella terms, when we're thinking about the specificity of anti-Black racism, the specificity of racism that different migrants groups experience. And so I think the importance in terms of, having these temporal conversations is understanding of how those different umbrella terms and in general, different terms of identification have ended up in the archive and how they are still used and how to then navigate that, right? And how to kind of have broader conversations about what it means to deal with archives that are definitely alive, but also incomplete and always bring up attention. So it's definitely not a project about romanticizing the past, but it's very much an endeavor to kind of go to those tensions, those archival tensions, but without kind of keeping them in the past, kind of thinking about how they continue to live on and how there are, again, all these different possibilities and limitations that one comes up against in doing archival research. So there's a larger question there in terms of, these unstable research terms, thinking about what lives, as I said, between the files and the boxes and the catalogs. And that ended up, for me, being, conceptually, theoretically, as well as visually, one of the more interesting things. Like, I was very much interested in kind of the scribbles in the margins of documents, in coffee stains, on the right here, or this is my right, this is a close-up of one of Audre Lorde's journals, which is actually part of the Spelman archives in Atlanta, Georgia, where I did a little bit of research. And there were a lot of like dried flowers, and those flowers had left like impressions on different pages. On my left, you see a coffee stain in one of the files that I looked at. And these were the kind of like ways that I became drawn to what lived outside of official categories. It was also a way for me to shift my engagement with the archive, and maybe also to make sense a little bit of the proliferation and obsession in many ways with the archive, which I think from a nationalist colonial standpoint is troublesome. And to also realize that those dynamics don't necessarily shift when working in a white feminist archive. So there was also that kind of recognition of, well, how do we have these sets of conversations about the violence that's reproduced in colonial and state archives that we know a lot about in just through scholarship and different artistic engagements with those archives. But we have, we don't typically have the same sort of conversations when it comes to white feminist or white queer archives, and to think about some of the institutional workings of archives and how that kind of reverberates. So that was an important question for me, and something interesting in terms of thinking about these ongoing histories of solidarity, of diaspora, thinking about different forms of memory work. And as I said, it was very much in between the different boxes, in between the different files, in between the messiness of categorization, that I became kind of interested in developing different stories from a coffee stain. And as I said, that this is also something that, like, visually, aesthetically is interesting to me about the archive, is that messiness and how we can kind of portray that. In general, I think also this messiness is important because a lot of these stories aren't linear, right? And in terms of understanding how these materials can be used and to what purpose, I think it's important that we get to kind of, follow feminist and queer stories from the 80s and see how, again, they're not just giving us different kinds of stories, but they also just punctuate a different timeline, if you will. So having these conversations about labor rights or sex work, or having conversations about anti-racist work, having kind of difficult conversations about solidarity practices, they also punctuate a different experience, which we typically don't receive or get within the archive proper. So there's definitely an important conversation there about the racialized, embodied ways that we can come to learn about the archive. So I think in terms of navigating the archive, thinking about access, thinking about messy archives, another entry point, which is really kind of what I'm kind of offering in this talk, is just thinking about these different entry points and conversations and tensions in thinking with this particular collection and archive. Was questions of orientation. So I think there, in terms of archival practice as well as curatorial practice, there are important ways that we tend to kind of engage with archival material, how we are meant to or expected to use archival material. So I became interested in different forms of orientation. If you read very theoretical archival approaches, it's very kind of, you know what you're looking for. You go into a catalog, you kind of request that material. It comes down on a trolley or down a lift, and you sit with these files and you photocopy them. And so, I mean, sometimes that was how my archival research went, but oftentimes that's definitely not what happened. So I think I'm also interested in terms of the practice of using archival research is this question of orientation and thinking about how we don't, it's not just us orientating towards archival materials. These materials also orientate us. So what is this kind of relationality between us and the archival materials? And again, what kind of dialogues and conversations come up in this process? And one of the important things for me as a researcher, as a curator, is asking these kind of complex questions about care, and thinking about what then the maintenance of care looks like. So if we are to kind of shift or experiment with the orientation towards archival materials, then what role does care play in that? So some of the questions I want to ask is, why does curatorial care matter? How do we think about the maintenance of care, and what are the conditions of care? And I think these questions are very much, as I said, they kind of, tap into a relationality with care. And typically there is something about working in archives, especially, as I said, as somebody who comes to an archive as a brown queer person. There is a larger conversation about what does it mean to develop a relationship with this larger body of work, and how is care in that sense kind of geared toward a different kind of futurity? Because I think part of this project, and I think part of a lot of more experimental archival projects, is indeed kind of acknowledging the complexities of the archive and not necessarily setting the archive up as an end goal. So many women, for instance, of the BMR movement are still alive, are still active, and it's an important question to ask: where will their materials go? For instance, it's a very practical question. Or how do we use those materials in exhibition spaces? And so, if we were to just kind of posit the archive as an end goal, without having these critical conversations and asking about, okay, but if your material enters an archive and the institution kind of disappears that by virtue of just the racial taxonomies on which the institution operates, then what's the purpose of having these queer and feminist histories of color within this broader archive? So there are different questions to be asked about, like caretaking in practice. And as I said, specifically kind of thinking about the maintenance work that care requires. And typically care work is this relationship that is not one-sided. So what different forms of maintenance do we need to apply to the archive? And, and how are these different forms of maintenance racialized and gendered and class, like according to whoever has a stake in the maintenance, applied to archives? So, I think there's opportunity there, as well as that these different forms of maintenance can obviously clash with each other. So this can result in collections within collections going unattended, names remaining unknown, how the absence of sometimes apparent violence in the archive could also then reproduce a different kind of violence. And I'm thinking specifically about how, there is often a narrative around these feminist and queer archives that, oh, these stories are just not here. We just don't know enough about them. So how do we kind of really critically grapple with the silences, as well as the absences in the archive? So I just wanted to close with a couple of examples that I found inspiring in terms of thinking about these care practices across temporality. So one of the things that I've been looking into is a lot of maps. There are a lot of maps because obviously there was no Google Maps in the 80s. So I really appreciated the amount of hand-drawn maps for events. These are two maps from the 80s, one for a National Black Women's Day. It just has details about how to get there with public transport, with cars. And there are a lot of different maps and routes and plans and descriptions. And, these kind of very simple iterations that aren't, as I said, not cataloged in the archive, they just kind of are part of the archive, are inspiring to me in terms of thinking about not just the care work that happened within this, within the BMR movement, but also thinking about how these maps kind of offer us different forms of orientation in relationship to how we engage the archival material. And something as simple as these hand-drawn maps that kind of come back in personal archives as well as the archives of different organizations have been really great to visually kind of see next to each other, as well as a lot of posters. So this also happens to be a poster for International Women's Day in 1983. And it says it's for African, South American, Turkish, Moroccan, Asian, and other, it uses the word in the 80s, foreign women. And so there's also a flyer here of a film screening of Betty Carter. And just the amount of flyers within the collection that, again, aren't necessarily cataloged, but kind of give you a sense of what was happening in terms of the creative interruptions in the Dutch landscape. And again, kind of punctuate a different story, a different timeline, but also give us, again, a different insight into the transnational and diasporic qualities of this movement, and kind of thinking about how in itself, this movement was not just trying to kind of create solidarity within the Dutch context, but kind of creating solidarity networks beyond the confines of the Dutch nation state. So I think part of the purpose of our conversation is also, again, kind of thinking about, what power do collections have to either kind of challenge or reaffirm the national story of nation states. So I will end it here. I think there is enough to talk about in the question section.
Thank you so much, Chandra. I'll open it up to questions because I'm sure people have them. But I just wanted to really comment on, this question of care and an embodied kind of sense of the archive and cultural objects is really coming through in terms of all of your presentations, it seems to me. And I just wanted to throw something to you, which was about, there's this transientness that's I'm finding, something that's so temporal and performative in so many ways. But I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the conditions and the idea of futurity in relation to the archives that you have, the objects that you're thinking about, that you're actually developing, that you're working with, and how you are. We've heard from hardly any archives or disparate archives to the minor archives that are associated with a kind of diasporic space to a digital archive. And I just wondered what your thoughts would be for the future of sustaining that legacy, that memory, that kind of longevity of that work, and how you might, what you might imagine, and where you might imagine them to be, and how might they be indexed, and what would be their future, their infrastructure, if you want to. And it's just to direct that to each one of you, maybe. But we have also a couple of questions as well. So I don't know if one or two of you want to respond to that.
Well, basically, I actually what I didn't get to say in my presentation is that maybe the act of collection itself in my practice didn't change, because at the beginning, I the initial proposal of my project was about collecting, but I started it on my own, and I started it through looking at the conventional resources in order to extract knowledge. But then, so basically, it's like I wanted to understand the particular time in a particular place, like post-Oslo in Palestine, in order to understand what happened in art. But actually, it kind of like flipped all the way around. It started to, instead of researching time and place in order to understand time, it's actually to understand art. I'm actually ending up using art to understand time and place. So I'm unpacking art. So and that's because the reflection I had to take in my practice within the PhD made me realize that actually my practice is not about producing objects. It's all about this encapsulated knowledge that kept circulating back into the work and evolving it. And I assume that every artist is doing that. And the knowledge accumulated in art practices, this is what I am after. So I'm actually, rather than collecting objects and the names of artists and matching it with what they are doing, I'm actually trying to collect narratives. So the meetings are about unpacking how those artworks are made with the artists themselves, who is paying them in Haifa, who is buying their arts in Haifa, where they are studying in Haifa, where they are allowed to travel, where they are not allowed to travel, who they are in touch with, etc. And so I end up just mapping the whole society, and then this became the prototype that I'm using to defend that actually this could work. But what in terms of futurity, I think I'm trying to challenge the definition of Palestine. I'm trying to challenge the definition of the archive. But I think there is no escape. That I see no escape of at some point transforming it into a conventional archive. Into a hub, into a repository where you need to keep things.
A physical thing.
Yes, but I am not I think I'm trying to revolutionize it a little bit by saying that I'm not keeping it for the sake of keeping. I'm keeping it to use it in my artwork. So I'm producing lecture performances based on the narratives I'm collecting. I'm also producing installations based on the narrative I'm collecting, and that's how I can keep my contribution in the art, which already I explained that it makes me uncomfortable because it's all about. So rather than escaping the realm of art that makes me uncomfortable, I'm still able to play this game and produce artworks that can be exhibited and sold, etc., etc. But at the same time, there is a whole dynamic that I'm trying to lead, and I'm not trying to lead it for myself. I'm trying to lead it for the community, or the broken communities over there, by inviting the artists to join my meetings, but also by inviting them to use those materials in artworks. Or maybe I would somehow play the role of a curator at some point to facilitate how to use those materials with those artists.
And very interesting and exciting that what you're doing is uncovering the process of making in effect, that as part of that process. I don't know if any of you want to also comment, or shall we move on to some questions? Do you want to add anything, Annie or Chandra?
I guess, firstly, I think the SAPC really isn't that organized as it sounds that it is organized. A lot of it was collected from basically, there was a kind of conscious decision, like we're not just going to collect materials from like well-known artists, but also younger artists. So trying to open it up to also people who just wanted their works to be seen and they would be happy to contribute. And so we tried to aim for a kind of more democratic approach of what people were willing to share from, say, underneath their beds to then the surprise donation of something more established, which is like Lehman's archive, right? So it's a real mixture of different types of materials. I think the question of futurity and the question of sustainability or the idea of sustaining the archive itself may or may not be the same outcome. I think one of the questions, some of the questions that we do have to tackle is the idea of accessibility. So that's always been something that we critique ourselves on, like, great that we've brought something to a space for live art that didn't have that material, but at the same time are these materials actually accessible to the region that from which it was taken from, right? So there's a lot of discussion of how these things could be made available online, but that's not moved forward yet. So there's a bit question about how can we do that, like within the budget that we have, and if LADA can't actually do that, then should we also undertake that to try to make that happen? The other thing also is that since then, there's been an accumulation of more materials and opening up to also activist materials. So again, there's a whole process of like, how do we bring that into the archive? How is that done? But there's always there's two aspects to it. I think there's always a tussle as well, because on one hand, you sort of want this to be open access for scholarship, for people to research in relation to making artwork and understanding work from the region. We're also talking about artists from the region who, in terms of economic power, maybe also be on a kind of different standard. And so how do people also make a living out of that, right? So I'm conscious of the fact that, we're appropriating what is kind of a knowledge capital or cultural capital. And there are all these principles of open access and, and so on. But at the same time, what does that mean for people who've made the work, who's in a different region, who need to make a living? So it's, I guess we're trying to find ways to make that probable, or find ways to create like best practice access, like whether it's like if institutions want to access it, then maybe they should pay a bit more, where it's quite different from a younger level research student and so on. So I think there's kind of that aspect, and how do we decentralize it, perhaps like such that LADA doesn't only have the only copy, but there'll be other places we can put it apart from being online. Yeah. How do we make it mobile, which already it has been, because it traveled to Munich as a kind of archive residence. So perhaps there could be more ways of doing that around the UK to make it more accessible to more people. So I think those are some of the sort of ideas from the boil.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience. So Martin is asking if he could hear a bit from the speakers about what for them defines an archive as opposed to an art collection. Does the relative marginality, the lack of cultural capital traditionally attributed to the archive by state structures, give a certain permission, a way around or away from the colonial? Or is the distinction between archive and collection less clear? Martin, I don't know if you want to kind of add to that or to vocalize it a little.
Yeah, no, it's the question of when I used to work at Tate, and I know at Tate the distinction between what counts as an archive item and goes off into the library and what counts as an art collection item is quite significant. So it's the question really of whether the archive collection, because it doesn't have necessarily the visibility, and it doesn't necessarily have the kind of investment, the cultural investment that art collections have, even within a museum structure, even within a single kind of institution, whether that offers opportunities or possibilities which just aren't there when you're working curatorially with an art collection.
Thank you. Chandra, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'm still thinking about this question. I'm sorry, there's like lots to say about it, but I think at the end of the day, it really just continues to come back to these racialized and gendered power dynamics in terms of who even gets to define what goes into, as you say, an art collection or an archival collection within a museum structure, right? And I think part of this kind of proliferation of all sorts of decolonizing incentives and all sorts of, hand in hand with all sorts of conversations about archives and what archiving is and what archiving shouldn't do. I think there's always this question about power, right, and access, especially within a racial capitalist like system, is like, how do we actually now make those decisions after the fact? Because those structures and systems have already been set up. And unless we really do the work of figuring out whatever people mean by decolonizing art collections and institutions, which I frankly don't really know exactly what that looks like or means oftentimes, even though I agree with a lot of the work that's being done, I think, we kind of come back to this question of power and really thinking about the power that already also is within those collections and archives, right? Because I think that's also, obviously, it's not that it's not just neutral, it's also that there are broader implications if we think about the kind of line of thought in terms of theory and practice, especially within the Western context, that is applied to making those divisions. So I don't really have an answer, but I do think it brings up other questions, right, about how we might go about that.
I just have a brief comment with that, because I think your question was posed as in whether that would make it less colonial or, but actually for this region of Southeast Asia, I think a lot of the archives that were from early on established there were established because of the colonial administration. I think the British were very good at creating archives through a lot of extensive documentation, whether it's through government administration or military administration. So I think, I'm not sure archives or collections are either less colonial, but they're both very much implicated in power structures.
Yeah. I completely agree with what Annie and Chandra said, and I think I had already mentioned that a little bit in my presentation, and I'm very much following like the way Laura Ann Stoller is dealing or like deconstructing or explaining colonial archives, and that's exactly what made me take a decision that I'm not really interested to deal or fix something that is already wrong from the very point of its established. It's not my responsibility as a colonized subject or as someone suffering observed occupation and injustice to come and say, oh, there's something wrong, let me help you fix it. So I completely, or I kind of like took another term towards collection, because I didn't want to deal with what is already there, and this is not an invitation to everybody to do that. This is a very personal choice that I thought it would work much more in the context of Palestine, especially that we are now in Palestine, like now at this moment of time, or since a few years now, we are in the process of building archive in the same way, in the same colonial way, the same Western colonial way, but in Palestine, and taking decisions of what is archive and what is not archive, what is art and what is not art, what is collectible and what is not collectible. And I don't want to bother myself with these definitions. And that's why so the archive for me is not the information that I am collecting and where I'm going to put it. The archive is myself as an artist and my peers that I am working with them in Palestine, in Haifa, and in Jerusalem, and in Ramallah. Those are the real archive. And even I went to also use my mom as a breathing archive, as a woman who lived through different periods of time and witnessed different shifts, that I didn't pay attention to that because I was mainly all the time longing for that institution of archive to exist in Palestine. So rather than heading towards, rather than being excitement about having something or exporting something that is already problematic or fixing something that is already problematic, that now that I am in the West, I just decided to go towards something completely different, do my own collection. And this is actually what made me realize that what I thought in my practice, or what I spotted as a fascination with archives in my practice, was actually all about me trying to escape the archive, trying to redefine the archive and find the meaning. What archive means in a context that is still under colonization nowadays, like Palestine.
Thanks, Bisan. That's I mean, really great stuff. I mean, I think that it really is calling into question this this issue that has been brought up again and again about what we think about in relation to indexing that's already established, and how do we think about this notion of taxonomies in a completely different way. What does it mean if we're in a decolonial space of doing that? Chandra, there's a quick question just before you go. I know you have to leave, but one from Geneva. I found your idea of navigating what lives in between the categorizations in archives interesting. Do you think there are specific approaches or methods within collection making or categorizing in the archives that can be introduced in order to eliminate these exercises of having to dig up, so to speak, these silenced histories?
That's just such a wonderful question. I mean, I think there's so many layers to that, but yeah, part of what I found is that even within like university structures and art structures, we don't really have broader conversations with students on how to do archival research. You know, I mean, from my limited experience in terms of teaching and working with students in the UK, in the Netherlands, and in the US mostly, I feel like students are just kind of sent out to this archive and just kind of told to you know, go find whatever it is that they need, and then kind of, you know, figure out how they're going to integrate that in either their dissertation or art-based PhD project, and, you know, kind of, you know, have some chats with your supervisor about it and maybe with other people. So yeah, I definitely think that there are, you know, having spoken to so many different practitioners and people and students, evidently we're all coming up against all sorts of complications and complexities in doing archival research, right? Whether that's about access or research methods, or how to tell different stories with materials, how not to kind of use the materials as just kind of source material, but to really incorporate stories and different aspects of material. I mean, we obviously could be talking about paper or audiovisual material or multisensory experiences. I mean, I think there's just, you know, if people are interested in doing archival research, I think there's so much more that we could be doing in terms of having critical conversations about how we engage material that kind of goes beyond this very Western approach to requesting material, sitting with the material, copying it, and then kind of synthesizing or analyzing that in the written and or creative work. And I do think this is where the intersection between art and academia is inspiring and important, right? Because then we get to see different kind of collaging and different kind of ways of interpreting and different ways of like going about silences and gaps and different like creative interpretations. And I think this also just was very visible in Annie's and Bisan's like presentations is the value of that. But I think it's not necessarily a given that we know how to do that, and especially kind of younger students and practitioners. So yeah, I'm definitely, as part of my practice, really interested in kind of changing the ways that we do archival research, approaching archival research. I think it's also important that we need to kind of interrogate the different like obsessions that there are with the archive, the different ways that the archive kind of becomes banal, but also, you know, the way that sometimes there's still kind of this distance of the violence of archives and how they perpetuate that, right? And I think, Bisan, you said this earlier, like it becomes very complex sometimes to even evade not perpetuating that kind of violence. And like one of the things that stood out to me after part of the African Studies collection at UCT Archives burned in South Africa was that just like within like the same week, like there were a lot of scholars that were just like, we should have a panel about this. We should have a conversation about this. We should be theorizing the loss of these collections. And I'm not saying that that is not important, but it also just kind of stood out to me that, you know, there are different ways of, again, engaging with the complexities in these histories and really kind of reflecting on our privilege in terms of, again, the relationships that we're able to have with these archives, the way that some people have never been able to access these archives, the way that, you know, we just like continuously need to have broader conversations. But in terms of, yeah, what lives between collections and how to kind of think about that and different approaches, I think it's just been beneficial for me in my specific kind of situation to just kind of dwell in archives and just to kind of, you know, kind of let loose a little bit of the formal instructions and even to just kind of observe what archives sound like and feel like and really have a much more intentional multisensory approach with what happens in archives and to not shy away from coffee stains and rusty staples and, you know, things that are a strain of hair, things that are like left behind in the archive that, again, I think cool that a lot of artists, and I won't go into a summary or a list of different artists that have inspired me, but I mean, I think that's where my inspiration has definitely come from in terms of dealing with some of the complexities of the archive and also bringing up the tensions into the work, right? Because I think that's also part of using these different forms of orientating ourselves to archival histories, whatever histories you work with, that you're thinking with the histories, that you're kind of taught partnering with those histories instead of just kind of co-opting them and just bringing them into the exhibition space. And just kind of being like, oh, this was part of the archive, but kind of really thinking about the structure of those archives, structure of exhibition spaces, and even the structure of like a research paper. You know, it's like these things have similarities, how an archive or image may show up in your Word document or in an exhibition space.
I just wanted to find out whether anybody else wanted to say anything before we close it. Annie or Bisan, any other comments you wanted to make or that are burning? Yes, absolutely.
Add on to that wonderful, sorry, Chandra, that lovely whole last bit of that, what you're talking about the rusty staples, and because I've just been going through a lot of archives at the moment where there are a lot of rusty paper clips, but also the presence of, you know, the trails of the silverfish. And it was really talked about recently with another colleague about this being part of, you know, endemic to archives in Southeast Asia as part of this kind of tropical climate where the silverfish itself, like eating through records, meant that, you know, there's a kind of impermanence that's suggested by that, which is natural and indigenous and, you know, digestible or non-digestible, however you frame it. So I thought that was really interesting. I just sort of, sometimes we think of the archive as being something very fixed, and maybe there's a kind of permanence implied in digitization, but I just love this idea of this image of this tiny silverfish that could just eat its way through records. And yeah, there's just something about that I'm still reflecting on.
I just want to thank you very much for such a wonderful contribution. I mean, I think, you know, for me, it's going back to this kind of relationship that we have to memory histories and how, you know, how vital artists and practitioners and curators are to thinking about a colonial kind of space and decolonizing process of that. So just to bring it back to the artist and your practice as researchers and curators and activists. So it's just to thank you so much, and again to just thank everybody for coming along and for the contributions that you've made. Thank you, Bisan, Annie, and Chandra for this last session, and thank you to the audience for such you know, I can hear the brains kind of ticking over, and we've had very, very positive feedback. So thank you very much indeed for that, and we'll sign off now. Thank you.